Here I'll show you how to fast search multiple workbooks using a file picker. So it's going to work like this. Input the search criteria, choose the field, and then hit the search button. And now we can choose any file, any Excel file from our computer. We can choose just one, and we get the results here, nice and easy. Goes down to 82. Or we can select multiple files. Let's select all of them. And it'll take a little bit longer. The files are quite large. And now, instead of 82 results, we have 36,400 and probably 89. So it's a really cool little feature, and this follows the previous two tutorials where I show you how to search an entire workbook and then how to search multiple workbooks. Here I'll cover what you need to do to get the file picker working with searching multiple workbooks, and that'll be the new part of the tutorial. And then after that, I'll cover stuff that if you've watched previous tutorials, you may have already seen. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to Teach Excel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. To get started, Alt F11 to go to the VBA window. Let's make this guy a little bit bigger. So what we have here, and make sure you go ahead and download the workbook so that you don't have to type all this by hand. Here once again is the search macro we created quite a while ago. And here is our macro that clears the data on the dashboard. And here is our new macro to search separate workbooks. This will look similar to the last tutorial where I showed you how to do it without using the file picker, but there are quite a few differences. So let me zoom in and let's get started. So what I've done here is at the top of the macro, I've got a search macro that does all the heavy lifting. And down here in the search separate workbooks, this just encapsulates that macro. So what we do, here we do everything with the files, and then we just send the file to the macro that searches all the workbooks. So what we have to do now is to get the files. So we have a few variables declared up here. One is to hold the master workbook, our dashboard. It's going to be the reference to this guy here where all the data goes. Then we have a slave workbook. That's the one that we're going to search through. And then we have a new thing, a file picker. It's a file dialog. So that's the actual window that appears. Now, before we get into the macro, you want to make sure that you have screen updating turned off. Application.screenUpdating equals false. It'll make your macro work so much faster. But if you leave that uncommented, so turn screen updating off, never ever ever forget to turn it back on at the end of your macro. Otherwise, Excel is going to work kind of funny, or maybe not work exactly how you expected. And then we call clear data. So clear data, remember we do that at the beginning of the macro just so that we don't have a bunch of duplicate data. Now this looks like duplicates because that's how I made the raw data, as I just copy pasted. But we want to make sure that when the macro runs, the first thing it does is it goes like this, clear, and then it adds the new data that we want. And that's this little guy here. And watch the previous tutorials to get an explanation of how it works. Now we want to make sure that we tell the macro what our master workbook is. So it's the active workbook. So WB master equals active workbook, special little keyword that just means the currently visible workbook basically. Now here is the stuff for the file picker. I have everything pretty heavily commented, so that'll be nice if you download the file, but I'm going to go through it here. This is what basically tells the macro we want to deal with a little pop-up window that allows us to select files. So it's application.fileDialog and then MSO file dialog file picker. Now that may seem confusing, don't worry about it. I'll show you how you type it out and it gets pretty easy to add it actually. So, and we're going to set this equal, or we're going to set this variable equal to all of this so that we can use it down below. So it makes our life a little bit easier. So to set the variable to this object, we just do set the name file picker and then start to type it. So once we do application dot, you'll see all the options fill in. Makes life really easy. File and then dialog, hit tab, open parentheses, and then we see the options that we have here. So file dialog folder picker, file dialog file picker, open, save as. We want to do the file picker, close parentheses, and that's it. So nice little thing that helps you to input the data. So now that we have a reference to our file picker, let's go ahead and control how it looks and kind of what it does, what it shows you. So here we control the file picker. We use a little thing I don't think I've shown you guys yet. It's with. So with allows us to write file picker once and not have to repeat it for adjusting or adding or creating properties underneath it. So what I would have had to do before is something like file picker dot filters. Where are we? Filters dot clear. Okay. File picker, and then you just have to keep going. And it's annoying, and it's tedious, and it's rather error prone. So here, once we do the file picker, you just go down here, hit a period, and you can go ahead and add the properties, do whatever you want. So that's what this little with guy means, and you might see that in a bunch of macros or a few macros here and there, and it looks really confusing at first. But it just makes it so that you don't have to keep putting this guy right here. I don't use it too much because it can make macros a little bit difficult to read, especially when referencing ranges and putting all that data in here, but it works great for the file picker. So file picker.filters.clear, it's going to clear any filters that we have in the file picker. What are filters? This is a filter. It allows us to choose what files are going to be displayed. So we do filters.add, and then here we can input, or we can type in what we want the user to see. So they want to see Excel files. And here we control the files that are displayed. Now that's kind of confusing, so let's go take a look at it. Click search once more. Let's zoom in a little bit. And then look down here right over open and cancel. You can choose the files that are going to be displayed. See Excel files? That's what we entered in the macro. Drop-down menu, the only option is Excel files. And it's only going to show us Excel files. But let's go back to the macro. This is the display text, but that doesn't tell the file picker anything. Excel files doesn't mean anything. It's just text that we output. This is what you use to determine what it's actually going to show you, what it's going to let you select. And so here we just use a little bit of the Excel file extension, Excel. It could be XLS, XLSX, XLSM, XL blah, 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 blah. So here we're just going to do a little blanket statement of allowing them to select any Excel file. You could change that to be CSV or really whatever you want. Or you could just completely remove it so there are no filters. So if we went like this, run the macro, you can see by default it just says all files. So you don't need to have the filter on there. But let's keep the filter. Kind of cool. And here we go, allow multi-select. That's a very important property. Do you want the user to select one file or multiple files? So here, search, I can click one, hit control, click another, or I could hit shift, select all of them. But if you set it to false, I'm sure you can imagine what happens now. You can only select one file at a time, no matter what. Hit control, I hit shift, doesn't matter. I'm going to leave that to true. Make sure we can select multiple files. Now that's really all that you need for the file picker properties. You don't need to do any of this actually, but this is what I'd recommend. And you can add a few more, although I don't think they help too much. Let's do a title equals my title. There we go. You could do select file, choose an Excel file, whatever you want here. Sometimes it helps the user, although I really never look at the title of a dialog box. So now we can see right up here in the upper left of the box, we have my title. So you've got a bunch of options down there, but yeah, like I said, these are the most important. So once you are finished setting the options for your file picker, well, it doesn't really do anything. We need to make sure that we can see it. We need to show the user We've created our file picker, added options, great. Now here is how we show it. File picker, reference the variable that we set right here, and then dot show. So what do we want to do? We want to show it. Now we want to set the variable here equal to the output of this. So you'll see real quick, if I comment this out and run the macro, nothing happens. Show it, bam. But what this is going to return, this right here, filepicker.show, is actually a number. And the number is going to be 0 or -1. It's 0 if they hit cancel. It's -1 if they actually selected a file, if they did something. So we need to check for that. Otherwise, we can get an error. So right down here is where we check if the user hit the cancel button or not. We use this little variable we created, put it in right here, see if it equals 1. You could also do, a lot of people just do this, if it doesn't equal 0. And now we encapsulate all of our logic within this if statement. But before I talk about all of this stuff right here, let's go right down here. So this is the second half of the if statement. I put a little else right here. And this is the section of code that will get executed if the user clicked the cancel button. Now right now I don't have anything there. So if we go here and we hit cancel, nothing happens. But if you want, you could display a little message box. No file selected. Something like that. Oops, message box, MSGBOX. Okay, so now when we run it, hit cancel, no file selected. Or, hey man, I can't do my job unless you select a file. So no file selected, okay, do whatever you want down here. Now let's get to the section where the file was selected. I'm gonna go ahead and add a comment here. So when you guys download this, you'll know file was selected. Now do something. And I will put a little parenthesis S. This works if one file was selected or multiple files were selected. So this tutorial is a little versatile. It's going to work if you have multiple files or a single file. And in order to go through multiple files, we need to loop through the selected files. Now to do that, we're still going to reference our file picker, little file picker variable here, and we want to reference selected items. So file picker dot selected items. And as usual, as I mentioned before, once we type file picker period, you can see all the options. Not too many here, so it'll be easy to figure out the right one. Start typing it, starts to fill in selected items. And what we have here is a for each loop that you may have seen in my previous tutorials. Basically, what you do here is you create a variable here that's going to hold the elements within this right here. So what the selected items does right here is it just gets all the files that were selected. So now we have a list of files, file 1, 2, 3, and this for each statement is going to go through that list of files. And each time it goes through for a file, it's going to attach that file to this file selected variable. You can name this whatever you want, just make it so it's easy to understand. That's a good idea. So now the file is in the file selected variable. So we can reference it down here. We can open that specific file. And so it goes through file 1. File selected then equals file 1. So we open file 1. Then when the loop runs again, it'll go through file 2. And file selected will equal file 2. And when the loop runs again, it just keeps going and going and going. And each time that this loop runs, each time that all this code within the for each loop runs, the file selected will increment in a way to be the next file in the list. So that's how you go through the list. I understand that can seem kind of confusing if you've never seen this before, but just know that inside of our loop, we reference the selected files using the selected file variable. At the end of the loop, make sure you have next and then the name of the variable, file selected. Now everything in here basically is the same as the previous tutorial for searching multiple workbooks. So if you already watched that, you already understand it, all is good, then no need to watch the rest of this tutorial because all I'm going to do is explain how this works. The only difference actually right here is instead of concatenating the directory and the file name, all we have to do is use the file variable file selected to open the file right here. So workbooks.open file selected. That's the only change. Everything else is the same. Okay, so what do we do here is we now use our workbook slave variable. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the workbook that we clicked in our file picker into that variable so that we can then send it to our data search macro and search through it. So we use workbooks, then type .open, and then give it the file to open, file selected. So we set this variable equal to all that, nice and easy. And then down here we use call, and then the name of our macro, and then we have to pass it 2 arguments. So an argument here, it allows us to send a variable to the data search macro. So when we first created the data search macro, there were no variables. It was just like this. But now, since we want to call it from another macro, we need to be able to tell it what to do. We need to tell it to put the data here in the WB master workbook that we referenced up here, and where to get the data in our WB slave workbook, which we just got right here. Now, once all of that's done, I'll cover the macro in just a moment. Once all of that is done, we want to get the WB slave macro, we want to close it, and we want to make sure that changes are not saved. In this tutorial, we just want to search the workbook. So open the workbook, search the workbook, close the workbook. Just these 3 parts: open, search, return data, then close. So save changes false. You may see it written like this without the argument listed, but I find it's a little bit less confusing, especially if you don't use VBA too often, to type in the argument that you're referencing. So false refers to the argument save changes right here. So save changes, colon equals false. All right, now let's get into the data search macro. So we're here. We tell the data search macro, put the data in WB master, get the data from WB slave. So let's go to data search to perform our search. If you have a macro and you want to give it variables, you do it like this right here. You type the name of the variable, and then, kind of like this down here, but without the dim, you tell it what the variable is. This variable is a workbook. So this reference right here is the same, or it's the same type as this right here. Dim WB master is workbook, WB slave is workbook. And up here, we accept a workbook type and a workbook type. Now these names don't have to be the same, but it makes your life a lot easier if you keep them the same, because you'll understand what you're dealing with between the macros. Now I'm not going to cover all of the data search macro. I did that extensively in searching through an entire workbook in Excel tutorial. But I'm going to tell you the few things that you do have to change if you're coming straight from that tutorial to figuring out how to use the file picker. So if you want to know what all this stuff does, which is very powerful, probably the fastest way to search Excel workbooks, then go ahead and watch the Search Entire Excel Workbook, or the fast version of that, and that'll explain this. But here, the thing that you want to change when you go from a normal macro to using this on multiple workbooks is you need to tell it what workbook you're in. So originally, when we go down here, we're setting our dashboard variable, and we just told it to equal sheets dashboard, because here, our worksheet name is dashboard. But, and technically we probably didn't have to do this here, but I find it very helpful and it makes it a bit more versatile when you're expanding the macros, we reference the master workbook. So we're saying not only dealing with the dashboard sheet, but make sure it's in the workbook master, the master workbook. We also had to change the columns, added 2 columns because our source data expanded from the entire workbook, the Fast Search Entire Workbook tutorial. I added 2 columns here, workbook and sheet. Helps you see where your data comes from, make sure everything's working. Let's go down here. Dashboard's been updated, so everywhere that you see dashboard down here, you don't need to worry about it. We're dealing with our master workbook. Down here, technically, once again, this might not be necessary, but it makes our macro a bit more robust. We want to loop through all the worksheets, but we want to make sure that we're going through the worksheets in the slave workbook through which we want to search. So we do wbslave.worksheets. And down here, I just had to update this line from this green guy right here to this one, because I did not make enough dashboard references when I was doing this. So that's one more change between the search entire workbook macro to this macro. Really just I had to update it, and it should have been done sooner, to be honest. But that's brings up one point that's rather important to mention, is that when you are making a macro in one workbook for the same workbook, there are a lot of things that you may overlook and that you may not pay attention to. Whereas then when you want to use that macro on separate workbooks and you're switching between them, you need to make sure that you are referencing not only the correct worksheet and the correct range, but also the correct workbook. And that can cause a lot of errors. So you can see we didn't have to make too many changes to this macro to search multiple workbooks. Just want to make sure we tell it where to put the data, where to get the data. This file picker down here, it's not really that complicated. This right here is pretty much the stuff that has to do with it. You just want to make a reference to the file picker. You want to put that into a variable, update its filters and any other options you want, and figure out if a file was clicked, then loop through the files. Easy peasy. Now remember, download this file so you don't have to type all this code in, look at the comments, and if you have any issues, make sure to let me know. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.